Now, coming back to the meaning of disasters, today what is our understanding of the disaster is something like this. You can see it is given here. Today we understand disasters as what? They are product of vulnerability plus hazard, and that is also capacity. So there are three factors according to this definition which are determining what will be the case of disaster. Now, very important thing, today what we recognize is that it is very clear that today we clearly make difference between what is hazard and what is disaster. We differentiate between it. So, hazard is different from that of the term disaster. So, what is essentially hazard? So, main difference between hazard and disaster is that hazard is essentially a dangerous situation or an event that poses a threat to humans, while disasters, if you talk about, is an event that actually harms human life, property, and thus disrupts social activities. Okay, so hazard is essentially what? Hazard is a situation of risk. We can simply say hazard is essentially what? It is a situation of risk. Risk which exists in the nature. Okay, so it is a kind of pre-disaster situation. Now, disasters will not be taking place till we place ourselves in such hazardous situation. Remember, the term disaster is a value-loaded term. What does this mean? It is value-loaded term in the sense that disasters, if you talk about, they are from the perspective of human beings. An event which we call it as disaster only when it has significant impact on the human beings. Okay, that is what we are calling it as the disasters. Otherwise, can you understand that floods, etc., all these are natural events and have been taking place since the origin of the earth, many of these disastrous events which we call them today. But we are talking about disasters from the perspective of humans. For example, take the case of floods. Floods also have very important role in ecology. We have already seen how floods renew the floodplains, fertility of the floodplains. But can you understand, we are classifying floods as disaster because they cause lots of damage to the human beings. Okay, so disaster is essentially a situation which will not arise if human beings are not involved. Okay, so when disasters occur when humans are placing themselves at a situation of risk, at a hazardous situation. Okay, so hazard is a pre-disaster situation, while if you talk about disaster, essentially is what? It is a situation which has caused damage. Okay, on the other hand, hazard is a situation where potential of damage exists, but actual damage has not taken place. Okay, so therefore a hazard can lead to a disaster that will completely disrupt the life conditions of the victims. However, both hazard and disaster bear potential threat to humans since both can result in loss and damage to life and property. A disaster is more critical in nature than a hazard, which might turn into disaster in extreme circumstances. Okay, so in simple terms, hazard is a pre-disaster situation. It can be harmful. Suppose a single individual or some people can be affected by such hazardous situations. So suppose there is a situation of risk existing, and in this situation of risk, a person when goes into a situation of risk, he might be affected. So it can cause damage to life and property. However, until and unless a event which will accelerate these risks exists or takes place, there will be no disaster. And one more precondition is that there should be involvement of the human beings. Then only we'll be calling it as the disaster. So this is the meaning of the term hazard. Okay, so hazard is the situation of risks which exists in nature. So for example, take the case of floodplain. Now, if you take the case of floodplain, We know that annually in India, floods are occurring in the Khadar. We have already seen what is Khadar. Now the question arises, why to go and construct houses in the Khadar region when you know that every year there will be floods? So there is a situation of risk exists. And when suppose if suddenly a flood comes, a person might be present there and he might get affected by the flood. So it would pose the risk of life and destruction. But it will not become disaster till several houses are built there in that Khadar region, in that floodplain. So when it happens, what will happen? The flood will have devastating effect and then it would become essentially a disaster. Okay, so this is the essential difference between the term disasters and hazards. Now we are using one more term here, vulnerability. So let us see what essentially is vulnerability. So it is the extent to which a community structure, service or environment is likely to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of hazard. Okay, so how much vulnerable a community or if you talk about community service etc. is to hazards and disaster. Okay, so suppose if you talk about, take the example of earthquake. Okay, earthquake is essentially what? A shaking of the earth crust. Now there is two scenarios which can exist. One scenario is that in an area there might be very weak buildings present, while in another scenario in an area there might be presence of very strong buildings. So in the first case where there is presence of weak buildings, that is a case of vulnerability. There is high vulnerability. On the other hand, in the second case where there is strong buildings, there is the case of the vulnerability being low, because here the community is in such a manner built that it has the ability to withstand the problems, it has ability to withstand these, if you talk about issues of hazards and disasters. So this is essentially what we mean by the term vulnerability. Okay, so if you talk about contributing factors to vulnerability, there are many, like tangible materials. They are easy to see, value easily determined, like for example, people, lives, health, security, living conditions, property, services, physical property loss, loss of use, economy, loss of products and production, income, environment, water, soil, air, vegetation, wildlife, intangible abstracts of vulnerability which are difficult to see, value difficult to determine, like the social structures, like family and community relationships, cultural practices like religious and agricultural practices, cohesions, disruption of normal life, motivation, will to recover, government response, etc. Then poverty is another, if you talk about type of vulnerability, people who are already in desperate state and are less able to recover. Some people are even more vulnerable, like for example, pregnant women, children, disabled, old age people, all these are more vulnerable. Okay. So other factors like population growth, population has grown dramatically over the past decade, so again that will make it more vulnerable. Rapid urbanization, growing concentration around the capital. For example, 2/3 of Samoan population lives in Apia. Transition in cultural practices, increase in substandard housing in more heavily populated urban areas, changes in traditional coping mechanisms, decline in self-reliance, food conservation, preservation, warning systems, etc. Environmental degradation, as resources are consumed, vegetation cover removed, water polluted, air fouled, country is more vulnerable to disaster. Okay, so all these are doing what? They are increasing the vulnerability of an area. So in general, if I suppose have to talk about vulnerability, I can talk about vulnerability in terms of tangibles or tangible infrastructure. So as I gave you an example of buildings, so if the houses are built, not strong houses are built, then the vulnerability will be higher. This vulnerability can be demographic in nature. Demographic in nature. So think, like for example, if the population density is very high, that means what will happen? There, if a disaster strikes, there will be more loss of life. So the vulnerability is high. Or think, if the urbanization levels are too much high, again this means that more number of people are residing in few places. That means very high population density. Again the same scenario. Or think about other aspects of demographic, like for example, take the case of scenarios like presence of more old age people in the population. Again, this means there is greater vulnerability. Same with the case of presence of more children or women or disabled. Again, that means there will be greater vulnerability of the population. This vulnerability can be economic in nature. Economic in nature, so you can understand that if there is greater poverty in a population, that means the ability to cope with the disasters is low. So that means there is greater vulnerability. Similarly, this can be administrative in nature. So for example, think that if there is the traditional bureaucracy which is characterized by lots of red tapeism, lots of corruption, then what will happen? The vulnerability of the population to hazards and disasters will be very high, because the administrative machinery which is there to help people in the events of disaster won't be able to do so, because disasters require very prompt efforts to be taken, and again such administrative machinery won't be able to satisfy these conditions. So that means greater vulnerability. Similarly, vulnerability can also be, if you talk about historical in nature. So think that we talked about the administrative structure. Many of the laws even today, we have inherited them from our colonial past. And this colonial past essentially has made many of these archaic laws which are still prevalent in India today. And several ineptness and several corrupt practices have become part and parcel of our culture as a result of such colonial history. Okay. So again, what it makes the population more vulnerable. It can also be socio-cultural in nature. For example, take the case of the Varn system in India. So Varn system, we know that in India there is the Varn system or the caste system, and there is lower caste people. In general, the lower caste people are the ones who are poor, and they have very low capacities. And as a result of which, what will happen? If suppose a disaster strikes, these will be the people who would be most affected. So again, what happens? Such socio-cultural practices would increase the vulnerability of the population to the disasters. So this is what we mean by the term vulnerability. Now, another term which we were using here was capacity. So capacity, what we mean by the term capacity? Capacity is essentially, it refers to the availability of resources. resources to deal with disasters. To deal with the disasters. Okay. Again, you can understand these resources can be multifold. So when I am using this term resources, these resources can be of economic nature. So a country can have lots of, if you talk about economic capacity to deal with the disasters, lots of money to deal with the disasters, or these can be of environmental nature. So again, a country, if you talk about, can have lots of environmental resources which can be used to cope with the disaster. For example, if there is drought, but still there might be presence of lots of water resources. India, for example, take. So in India, we find that there is lots of water resources which are present in part of India. That is the eastern part of India. Western part is more dry. We have already seen that. So most of the drought events have maximum impact where in the Western India, in the Central India. But we still have environmental resources. Suppose if we decide to bring water from eastern to western or from surplus rivers to deficit rivers, can we be better able to cope? Yes. Okay. So these can be environmental in nature. These can be also demographic in nature. For example, think about this, that India has a demographic, India is experiencing a situation of demographic dividend. So what does this means? This means that we have lots of young population who is in the working age group. So think young population, even if there are disasters, damages, again, because they are young, they have greater physiological capacities, the chances that they will be able to cope with the disaster will be higher. So there will be greater capacity. Similarly, there will be, these can be socio-cultural. So if we look into the village culture of India, the individualism in the village culture has still not so much developed. There is still that community feeling very, very strong. Okay. So again, when there is such type of culture, community culture present, if there is disaster striking, the community as a whole will be tackling those disasters. And thus we can say that such kind of community will have greater capacity to deal with the disasters. Okay. So this is the meaning of the term capacity. So friends, this is essentially our today's understanding of the disasters. We do understand that disaster is not just hazard, but it is hazard plus this risk is enhanced by several factors of vulnerability. Although if you have greater capacity, the risk will be reduced. Okay. And when these all combine, then only what will happen? There will be disasters. So again, other type of vulnerabilities can be there, like lack of information, civil strife and unrest. If it is there, suppose there are riots in a country, that can also be a problem. Geographical isolation, suppose we have seen that many times in Ladakh, some disaster like cloudburst has occurred. Now it is almost cut off from rest of India. The impact will be very, very high. So high disaster impact, political uncertainties and instabilities, like take the countries of Africa, there is lots of political uncertainty and instability. So again, it becomes what? It makes the situation vulnerable because there is hardly anyone who can take decisions. There is hardly anyone who can help during the disasters. Okay. So that is basically what we mean by disasters.